Basically, um, so it's a plant hopper native to Eastern Asia, and it first showed up in Pennsylvania in 2014. And if you're trying to convince people that invasive species are bad and something we have to worry about, spotted lanternfly would be your friend there. Probably the only case where spotted lanternfly would ever be your friend. So the impacts are just so obvious and so severe, particularly with crop species. So the main concern here is grapes. So spotted lanternfly is a sap sucker. It kills grapevines, so a huge concern for the vineyards, and lots of money could potentially be lost. So it's a big concern in New York. There's tons of vineyards in New York. There's a bunch in Long Island, especially the North Fork region. So it's a huge concern. It's also a nuisance species in cities. We've found in the past few years with the abundance they get to, and the sooty mold and the honeydew that's produced. So those are the main impacts. In terms of ecological impacts, that's kind of still not completely known. So we do know that spotted lanternfly feeds on a bunch of different species, including ecologically important native species. But we're still not sure what the ecological impact is, or what the impact is on a forest, for example. So we don't know that yet, but there are some clear impacts, like agriculture. So because there are all of these concerns, there's been a whole lot of work to try to monitor this species, prevent the spread, manage it where it occurs in some cases. So there are detector dogs that can sniff out egg masses. People put up bag traps. There's quarantine zones. If we look at New York State in particular, there's a whole lot of organizations doing really great work. So a bunch of agencies, USDA, but also a bunch of state agencies. The PRISM network does a lot of work with spotted lanternfly. All of these organizations doing really great work, but the real value comes in with not the work that these organizations do individually, but how they work together. So Ag and Markets is leading the spotted lanternfly efforts for New York State. They're sort of the coordinators, and all of these different groups are really all working together and communicating. For example, the monthly PRISM calls, which are not specific to spotted lanternfly, but there is also a lot of spotted lanternfly specific communication going on as well, which is the really special part about this effort, and what is kind of the key to its success. But no matter how wonderful that is, we can't possibly monitor the whole Northeast for spotted lanternfly without the help of volunteers. So there are a lot of people out there in the general public who care deeply about invasive species, environmental issues, agriculture, and they're willing to help. And they often have the skills that they need to help, or they at least have the potential to develop those skills if you help them. And so for New York State, one of the most simple and concrete things that a person from the general public can do to contribute to the efforts to prevent the negative impacts of invasive species statewide is report the invasive species in their area. And in New York, we use iMapInvasives to do this. It's a database and mapping system, and it's the official invasive species database in New York, used by PRISMs, agencies, and other partners. And it's administered by the New York Natural Heritage Program, where I work. We're more well known for our rare species work. You might have heard Greg's talk this morning. So we're from the same organization, but I'm in the invasive species section. And so you can use iMapInvasives to report species, view distributions. You can set up early detection email alerts and track control efforts and results, and more. And so in talking with Ag and Markets and their efforts to monitor spotted lanternfly, we realized that we need more eyes on the ground. We need help from people to cover more ground, and we need data going into a centralized database where ag and markets can easily access and review that data. And so what we came up with was this volunteer project where volunteers would pick a location to survey, check for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven at multiple points throughout the year, and report whether or not they found it to iMapInvasives. And I'll briefly walk through each of those. So for picking a location to survey, the idea here, it partially was inspired by reading Bird Atlas and other community science efforts that had people sign up for grid squares. But the idea is to direct volunteers, or at least some portion of volunteers, to the locations where we need their help most. So thinking about how to make sure professional survey efforts and volunteer survey efforts are complementing one another and not duplicating efforts. So essentially trying to collaborate in order to spread our efforts out and cover the most ground possible. So we did not open grid squares in locations where we don't need volunteers to go in and survey, like areas where we already know SLF is already very well established. We don't necessarily need people to go in there and report it since we already know it's there. And also areas that are already being covered by staff surveys. We want to focus volunteer efforts on the areas outside of those staff surveys where we need help. And I won't go over the GIS specifics for the sake of time, but I'll just mention that it's in an ArcGIS Online environment. It was built in Esri Web App Builder, and essentially people go in, they look around, they pick a grid square where they would like to do their surveys, and then they enter their information, and it puts their user ID on, or their iMapInvasives person ID on that grid square. And sort of connects them to it. So that's the where they're going to conduct their surveys, but then what are they going to do in those grid squares? So the next part is checking for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven at multiple points throughout the year. So obviously spotted lanternfly is the main priority here. In most places, if you find spotted lanternfly, that's a pretty big deal. Most places outside of the 5 boroughs, at least. But why is tree of heaven involved here? And Andy mentioned this, but there's a very strong connection between these two species. Spotted lanternfly really loves tree of heaven. It's its preferred host. But one thing that's different about tree of heaven is that while spotted lanternfly is kind of new and emerging in most of New York, tree of heaven's been here for a while and it's pretty widespread. If you report spotted lanternfly in Suffolk County, that's a big deal. Alarm bells would be ringing. If you report tree of heaven in Suffolk County, we already know it's there. We might not know it's in that particular location where you found it, but we do know it's generally found in disturbed areas throughout New York. But that actually kind of is good in some ways. Well, it's obviously a big risk because it can facilitate the spread of spotted lanternfly. But in terms of volunteer engagement, we found it's very helpful to pair these sorts of new, hard to find species like spotted lanternfly with a species that volunteers are more likely to find. So that just kind of increases the possibility that a volunteer is going to find something, which helps keep them engaged. So say they go out looking for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. We're hoping they're not going to find spotted lanternfly because we're hoping it hasn't spread to wherever that volunteer is yet. But maybe they'll at least find tree of heaven and they'll map that for us, which will be very useful, give us another place where we know to check for spotted lanternfly in the future, and also give us a better knowledge of the distribution of this other invasive species, even if it's not as high of a priority as spotted lanternfly. And then the last part of the process we're asking volunteers to do is to report their findings to iMapInvasives. And so that's presence records and not detected records. So why do we want not detected records? So if you're looking at a map and you see looking at a map of spotted lanternfly observations and there's a blank spot, it's hard to say whether or not spotted lanternfly, hopefully it's not there yet, but could it just be that no one's checked there yet? And so if someone goes to that area and actively looks for spotted lanternfly and doesn't see it, if they document that in iMapInvasives, that's super useful. So that helps us, we could prioritize our efforts to the places where really nobody has checked. If people are doing that each year, it'll help us track the spread of species through time. For instance, if we have a presence observation and we have not detecteds from the previous year, we can see that it's a new infestation, and which can be helpful. But I'll mostly talk about the presences. So what happens when you report something to iMapInvasives? So everything goes in as unconfirmed. It has to go through review before it's considered a confirmed report, just to maintain data quality. So email alerts, if you submit a record of Tree of Heaven, email alerts will go out to our confirmers, and those records will all go through our confirmers, who will look through records, see if the species matches the photo, and anything that comes out the other side and is indicated to be confirmed by these confirmers, that will go onto our public map and be a verified record in our official distribution data. Spotted lanternfly, that data is slightly different. So it has this special confidential until confirmed status. So the email alerts only go to people with that confidential viewing status. And for spotted lanternfly, that's ag and markets. So they review the data. And once they confirm records, then they go into our public map and everybody can look at those records and see the distribution. And also at that point, email alerts will go out to anyone who set them up, not just the people with the special viewing access, because the data will be available to everyone once it's confirmed. And just to talk a little bit more about those email alerts, these are very helpful for natural resource managers who are monitoring invasive species in their area. So it kind of saves you from having to remember to log in and check IMAP every single day, and check for like the species and locations you're interested in. So if you just tell IMAP you're interested in a certain list of species within the Lisma prism plus 20-kilometer buffer or something, and you just want to get that email alert every day at 9 a.m. or something, that means at 9 a.m. you'll get a list of just those species in the location you're interested in, every day at 9 a.m., representing the records from the past 24 hours. And there's all sorts of customization you can do there. So that's the effort that we came up with. How do we actually get people to participate? So our main outreach strategy consisted of this 4-part webinar series, all throughout the year, focusing on different stages of the spotted lanternfly and Tree of Heaven life cycles. Hundreds of attendees, hundreds of people attended throughout the year and watched recordings. But how did they hear about it? So we use social media and e-newsletters a lot. And what we really relied on was our partnerships with people across the state, particularly the prisms. So how do I, in my office in Albany, how do I reach the Long Island community, for example? Because I am not plugged into that community necessarily, at least not directly. But I work with LISMA and they are very plugged into the local and regional communities. So Haley and Bill and Abby were all very helpful, promoting on their website, sharing posts on social media. And that's really how we got the message out to any region, really. We relied on our partners who were plugged into those regions to get our statewide effort down to the local and regional level. So we're very grateful to our partnerships for that. There was also this tri-agency joint press release, which helped publicity. And we collaborated with the Invasive Species Awareness Week that New York State puts on each year, led by DEC and Ag and Markets, and the Prisms, of course. And to give you an idea of how that went for 2021, here's one region in the lower Hudson Valley where you can really see that having people sign up for these grid squares kind of got them out into these areas where we were requesting surveys. So that was good to see. So that's an example from the lower Hudson Valley. But the effort in Long Island was also really excellent. So you can see we had reports from one end of Long Island all the way to the other end, which is really great to see. You can see there's a lot of presence records in the West, of course, in the New York City area. But I think the most remarkable thing here are the not detected records. So there were 50 not detected records in Long Island. I got this from a report in iMapInvasives that I generated. So that means there were 50 cases where someone in Long Island went out, checked for spotted lanternfly in one of these areas where it's not known yet, and they didn't find it, and they recorded that effort in IMAP. So you can see this one point here where I think it might have actually been Haley that submitted this point, but a Tree of Heaven record. They found Tree of Heaven, they checked for spotted lanternfly and didn't find it. So that's really great to see that effort being documented here. And that's the Long Island focus. Here's the statewide summary. Lots of effort across the state. Over 100 grid squares were completed with data. Hundreds of records submitted. And the key thing I want to highlight here is before 2021, there were only 21 SLF not detected records, but that increased to 675 in 2021, mostly from volunteers. So a real increase there. And I'm almost done. I know I'm going a little bit over, I think. I'll wrap it up. So we asked people to do something and they did it. So that was great. But community science is supposed to be a partnership, not a one-way, we tell you to do something type of thing. So we sent out a survey to figure out how people felt, what did they struggle with, what was reasonable to ask of them. The only thing I'll highlight for now is that a lot of them said that the act of signing up for a location and putting their name on it and making that commitment, that was something that helped motivate them to actually complete the action. And they also mentioned that recognition of top reporters might be an additional incentive. So we might consider some of our strategies from IMAP challenges that we do each year, where we reward top reporters. And for 2022, we have launched it for 2022. Already 70 grid squares claimed across the state, but as you can see this map, lots of squares to claim in Long Island. Those yellow squares, those are actually picked out by Long Island Prism. I think Haley picked those out as locations where we need help looking for spotted lanternfly. And so my take-home messages are that community science offers concrete help for monitoring invasive species. And it's important to have the professionals partner with community scientists and leverage your efforts so that they complement one another and cover the most ground that you can. Commitments and signups are great motivators, and collaboration between agencies, conservation partners from local to regional scales, and database managers is essential and provides a lot of benefits. So all of these things take work to maintain and get going, but we've found that that it really pays off in the end, and what the sort of data we get in the end makes all that effort worth it. And with that, thank you so much to all of our partners and to LISMA, and I'll pass it off to the next presenter.
Thank you, Mitchell. Great job. There'll be an opportunity for questions and answers after our next speaker, who is Moses Susira. Moses completed a BS degree in forest health and an MS degree in entomology from SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry, or ESF. After his time managing ticks, mosquitoes, and other landscape pests and diseases across Long Island as a certified arborist, Moses became the tick entomologist for Suffolk County Department of Public Works, Division of Vector Control. Currently, he examines existing and emerging tick management strategies and products through locally held field efficacy trials and provides technical assistance to entities interested in tick management. Moses operates a long-term tick surveillance program across Suffolk County, which tracks native and invasive tick species, populations, seasonal activity, and environmental parameters to help improve management efforts. His long-term efforts have worked towards implementing an area-wide tick mitigation program within a Suffolk County park to assess the feasibility and functional potential for a municipality-based tick control program. Please join me in welcoming Moses.
Hey, Bill, thank you. Appreciate it. And
Oh,
thank you,
welcome.
everyone, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So let's see here. I will share screen here. All right, can everybody see that?
It's yes.
Okay, great.
It's not in presentation mode though.
Yep, yeah.
All right, you got that. All right, good.
I had a bar from the Zoom that was blocking it.
All right. I hate when that happens.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So again, thank you everybody for giving me the opportunity to speak today. We get to talk about a new type of invasive and potentially ways to control it. So I know they're a little bit hard to see, but if you look closely amongst the leaf litter here, you can see some Lone Star ticks. And this was in one of our arena trials where we were testing current commercial tick control products, both natural oil-based and your traditional synthetic. And we actually track them with UV fluorescent powders, so we get a better recovery rate than your traditional flagging method. So with that, we've been able to find a lot of interesting things out about them, but that's just one of the fun things I get to work with through the county. So the ticks that we're going to be talking about controlling today, I'm going to go over them very briefly. The biology makes quite a bit of difference as far as how you manage them and what vegetation management techniques will actually work with them. So the first one we're going to go over is the deer or black-legged tick, Ixodes scapularis. So this one is most well known for transmitting Lyme disease. It is a 3-host species tick, which means that between the larval, nymphal, and adult stages, they will change host preferences. So during the larval and nymphal stages, they actually can feed on over 100 different small mammals, reptiles, and ground-dwelling birds and migratory birds as well. So they feed on quite a few things. So when you're talking about host biodiversity, in areas where you have a high level of biodiversity for potential hosts, you actually see lower levels of Lyme disease in the tick population because they less often feed on the reservoirs for Lyme disease, which is primarily the white-footed mice. And at this point, there are a few others, but the primary one that drives that cycle is the white-footed mice. So if you can do anything vegetation management wise to increase the biodiversity of the local hosts, you can actually reduce the rate of Lyme disease in the local population of ticks and potentially reduce the population of ticks itself. So you can actually impact tick management on two different foci, basically. So the next species we'll be talking about is the Lone Star tick. So this one is considerably more aggressive than the deer tick. It subsists in considerably drier areas than the deer tick. This one, due to its mobility, it can very quickly go after a host and then run back over to a appropriate microclimate where it won't dehydrate. That being said, compared to the deer tick, the Lone Star tick is basically built like a tank. It takes a very long time for this species to dehydrate. So when you're talking about vegetation management, the overall goal generally is to actually reduce relative humidity in the area and potentially bring in more of a light source to help dry things up. And given a lower level of relative humidity, it makes it difficult for the ticks to quest. So they actually can't quest as often. And in a lot of cases, it'll actually drive them from that location because they can't stay there without desiccating and dying. So, but since this tick is highly mobile, it can jump into those areas, go after a host, and if it is unsuccessful, it can just run back out to an area that you're not actively managing. So if these are on the property, vegetation management can only do so much for you. It's still a very helpful management technique for ticks in general, but again, the species plays a big role. This is again a 3-host tick species, but they do have a slightly different preference than the deer ticks. All stages of this species will feed on white-tailed deer, and they prefer larger hosts. So that's part of the reason why they can populate so quickly, is because they have a higher quality host preference for all stages than the deer tick. Then we have the American dog tick, still fairly common in open wooded areas. I'm sure that a lot of you encounter them if you're doing any sort of vegetation surveys in fields or things like that. This one was more common about 30 years ago, but populations have become more isolated because of land use change and fields either becoming parking lots or developing into brushlands or forests as we see locally here. So this is again a 3-host species. They're considerably larger than both of the others, and only the adults actually feed on humans. So it's actually fairly easy to find them on your person if you encounter them. That being said, they do have the potential to spread Rocky Mountain spotted fever, so that's one thing we have to look out for. A new species that we've recently come across with is the Asian longhorn tick, Haemophysalis longicornis. So this was initially found in New Jersey, and they thought they had originally found it in 2013. And when they went back and they actually checked all the older samples they had, they actually found out that they actually collected it in 2010. But it wasn't recognized properly. It was actually misidentified. Currently, we have populations in quite a few states and counting, and we're finding more and more every year. It's a 3-host species, and it feeds on quite a few of things we have locally. It doesn't generally bite humans from what we've seen. And currently, in Suffolk County in particular, we've seen it in multiple stages. So we know that we have populations that are permanent at this point in time, as we found larval, nymphs, and adults from the same areas within about a 2-year period of time. And since it has about a 2-year life cycle, that's what you would expect. We suspect it's actually spread by birds, as that's one of the more common hosts for the larvae and the nymphs. And based on the relatively few number of sites we actually sample across the island, and the fact that we found them at almost every site, it's likely widespread throughout Suffolk County. And it's just a matter of time until we start seeing the excessive densities that this species can reach, because they do not need males to reproduce. The females are parthenogenic, so functionally, to create a new population, you only need a successful female in an area with a successful feed. So unfortunately, that is something we're going to have to deal with going forward. And based on a few of the studies that are currently available, it looks like the majority of Long Island and more of the southern sections of, or I'm sorry, the northern sections of PA and some northern sections of New York, as well as the entirety of the East Coast, are functional habitat for this species. So we do expect it to spread consistently. At this point in time, I believe they have found additional locations in Connecticut where they've identified it as well. And we seem to find locations of it in new states yearly. And another species we found recently was actually LISMA found this last year. They found the Gulf Coast tick over in Islip, and they noticed that it was different than the American dog tick. So that's actually something you don't generally get to see because a lot of people don't know their tick ID that well. So it was wonderful that, you know, people who had the experience actually came across this specimen and were able to identify that. And when they sent it into USDA, I believe that this was the first positive identification of this invasive species in New York State. So that's something we'll be keeping our eye out on moving forward, and we'll also be doing additional surveillance in the future, trying to find any other sites that this tick may be poking around. So vegetation management is one way to manage every species of tick. As we mentioned earlier, the biology of the tick does play a role in how well each of these strategies work, but the general overall purpose is to reduce relative humidity, get more airflow, and more light onto the area. And that makes it more difficult for the ticks to survive. Generally, ticks spend about a third of their time questing, and the other portions of their time they spend in a microclimate above 83% relative humidity, which allows them to rehydrate. And they actually rehydrate. It's a very slow process, but it's really interesting if you think about it. They actually regurgitate a salt and mineral-based solution on their hypostome, which is their mouth part, and it absorbs the moisture from the air. And that's why they need a high relative humidity. And as they process that and do this cycle several times, they're actually able to extract enough water to rehydrate. Then they go back up and quest, dry out, and do the whole cycle over again. So the more you can keep relative humidity low, the less time these ticks have to quest. The less time they have to quest, the less successful they will be in feeding and successfully reproducing. And that's how you drive out local populations over time. So ways you can do this is mowing, and that basically helps break down material so it deteriorates faster. So it helps reduce their local cover. Controlled burns are another way to do this, but they have to be consistent. If you do a controlled burn and clear out the area, and then you actually let your pioneer species come back into the area, they actually create a new food source for all of your local mammals and deer and birds, which actually increases the host activity on that previously burnt site, and then your tick population increases. So it's something you have to do consistently if you're going to do controlled burns. Another option is widening and trimming of trails and removal of boardwalks like this one in this photo. And if you actually walk on some of these boardwalks here in Suffolk County during basically any time of the year when the ticks are active, which is basically now until freeze, you will see them come up from between the floorboards and come up from around the edge of this, and they'll instantly be at the base of your foot, because this provides an excellent habitat for them to rehydrate when they're not questing. And it also allows them very quick access to hosts, us, or our dogs, or anything else that's walking on this boardwalk. So when we think about how we design parks and how we set up spaces for us to enjoy them, we need to consider how that's actually going to impact the tick activity on site, and if it actually helps reduce public health risk, or if it actually makes things a little worse. So another thing we can do is canopy thinning, or basically catching up on pruning over trails to help bring in a little bit more light and airflow. Also things like storm damage and things like that, that generally they need to be cleaned up. Unfortunately, with staffing and resources being generally low, when a tree falls down in a park over a trail, they buck up the logs and they put it right next to the trail. That actually creates additional small mammal habitat. So you'll have increased chipmunk and white-footed mice and numerous other animal activity right around that brush pile and log pile. And over time, you'll get an increased density of ticks right there next to the trail. So management is one thing we need to look at in our wilderness areas that we are generally using. So that's one of the things we're looking at for our pilot program. So another thing is looking at the understory and brush in these actual environments. And there are some invasive plants that actually help increase the tick population dramatically in a small location. So we actually need to start considering what type of understory brush is in that for us when we're talking about tick management. And as for leaf litter removal, it's not realistic to remove leaves from an entire park, but what we can do is push them back away from the trails a little bit and move the leaf pile to a far off corner in the park or deeper in the woods where there's less direct human contact. And that basically will minimize your chances of encountering the ticks. A thing that works very well for American dog ticks and deer ticks is actually mulch or gravel edge barriers. This is basically a xeric zone. So you create an area here that is consistently dry or drains and dries out very rapidly. And it's less likely that your deer ticks or American dog ticks that are questing on this ecotone habitat, it's less likely that they will make the jump across that and onto your high use zones when they see a potential host. Unfortunately, with Lone Star tick, they are so aggressive and so quick, they'll cross a 2 or 3 foot barrier in under a minute. So if they're on the property, you either need to make this xeric zone a little bit wider, you need to push back your ecotone edge or thin it out a little bit so it's not as dense as this one in the photo. But it is considerably difficult to control American or Lone Star ticks just with vegetation management alone. So these are some of the basically host locations that will see increased populations of ticks. Deep leaf litter, storm damage, when you have bucked up logs or firewood or brush from the top of a tree. I know that creates wonderful habitat for some ground dwelling birds, a lot of ground dwelling mammals, but it will increase tick populations. So along a trail like this, that's considered a high use zone. That's where you would want to manage ticks to minimize the interaction between potential hosts or human hosts. So along trails, we need to clean this up. And that's not a small effort, as we all know. And me actually being a certified arborist and coming from a tree care company, it's quite a bit of work. When you think about how many trees come down or need active management in a park or any wilderness setting, it's kind of a daunting task. So we need to consider how and where we actually approach it. Now, tick management in a private property is a little bit simpler because it's more of a manicured area, but the general concept is the same. You have your xeric zone around the edge of the habitat, and that's the area you keep dry. And then you have your high use zones several feet away. And one thing we need to keep in mind is our decks, mailboxes, and anything close around the house or any other building where there might be ticks. If you have a deck that's up off the ground, that will actually attract small mammal activity. And in some cases, birds will actually use that and they'll go under there and look for food sources. That will potentially create a local tick population there. So when we're looking at how we're actually designing these properties, we need to take these things into consideration and possibly build in some of these management concepts as we're actually setting things up, at least down here on Long Island. As you see here, they have their wood pile well away from the high use areas, which is exactly what you would like to see. And then, one of the biggest things that actually drive the need for vegetation management and the heightened tick populations down here is actually the extremely high deer densities that we tend to have throughout the Northeast and especially here on Long Island. So deer have quite a few ecological effects that we tend to see. Over 20 deer per square mile is generally what the studies say is too many animals per host range. You see an increased level of ticks because of a preference for native plants. For the white-tailed deer, you tend to see invasive plants do better, and they actually can take over entire understories. You have a greatly decreased biodiversity of plants in the understory, and they'll actually take out the secondary and tertiary saplings that will be the next generation of trees in 30, 40, 50 years. And those would be the trees that would take over when you have a section that is storm damage. But when you have too many deer, those trees don't survive. So we functionally don't have an understory to replace the mature trees that we all have on our properties here and in our parks. So that's going to be quite a bit of a problem in the next 30 or 40 years as we start seeing these dominant mature trees fall into succession. And also this reduction of biodiversity decreases the biodiversity of birds, ground-dwelling mammals, and numerous other hosts. And since it doesn't really affect the white-footed mice populations too much, that can actually increase your Lyme disease level in your local tick populations. Now, when you have just around enough deer, 15 to 20 per square mile, you see native plant regrowth because they're not clearing out all of their preferred vegetation because there's enough food for them. And you see a lower rate of spread for invasives, and you see a normal rate of tick success. And with too few deer, there also comes some significant downsides to not having enough herbivory in a location. You can actually get native plants that begin to almost act invasively because they do not have enough herbivory pressure. And that can actually, it can cause them to act as they are invasives. And when you also have too many or too few deer, it may allow other animals more access into the site, and you can actually have a shift of the primary host for the ticks. So in some areas, this has actually been found to be turkeys. If there's not enough white-tailed deer locally, they will shift onto turkeys. Or if you have wild boar in some states, they'll shift to the boar. So it's not just white-tailed deer that we need to be thinking of when we're trying to set things up so we can properly manage things. Now, one species in particular that I want to highlight here is Japanese barberry. So Japanese barberry was largely used in the ornamental industry for quite a while. And it is a relatively pretty plant, has a gorgeous red fruit, as you can see from the photo. It creates quite a bit of mast for small mammals and birds, and it attracts quite a bit of animal activity. And over the years, we found out that it is actually a pretty hardy invasive throughout the Northeast. And due to the high level of transpiration that these plants carry out, they actively increase the level of relative humidity local right around the plant. So ticks can actually quest on Japanese barberry almost 24/7 without needing to rehydrate because the relative humidity is so high. So that gives them an elevated level of success as far as finding hosts and successfully reproducing and feeding. And what we've found from the published studies, when you actually go through an area and remove barberry, your relative humidity drops back down to normal, and your tick density drops considerably when you take away that invasive species. And this species is currently, it is a prohibited species, and it is banned from sale in New York as of 2015, but it is still prevalent in the environment all over the place. I know that I have several of them on my property down here on Long Island that I've been fighting with for a few years now, trying to get rid of them without the use of herbicides. This is one species that we will be looking at removing when we do vegetation management work in Indian Island County Park in the future for our tick pilot program. So another thing we will look at when we're talking about vegetation management is actively bringing back that biodiversity. And one way to do that is actually exclusion. So you can put up fencing to minimize the deer entry and using that area as food, basically. And you can see a dramatic regrowth in the understory when you reduce that drastic herbivory pressure. And it will actually generate increased animal activity over time. But as we mentioned before, if you increase the biodiversity of hosts, that can actually lower the level of Lyme disease in that local population of ticks. because they are not just feeding on white-footed mice and chipmunks and maybe squirrels or raccoons. They're feeding on numerous other small mammals and birds that are active on the site. There are some obvious downsides to this. You cannot put these anywhere near roadways because there are some collision issues. Unfortunately, deer vehicle collision numbers, that's actually considered the primary predator of white-tailed deer is deer vehicle collisions. So we can't effectively fence off entire parks. We know that it's not a functional option, but we may be able to thoughtfully put these fences in some locations to redirect some of the deer activity. So maybe we could put them around the ball field, maybe 20 or 30 feet into the woods to get them to stop going through the field and dropping ticks. Or maybe we could use that same strategy around the playground or some of the camping locations, just to try to minimize how often they're in those areas. And over time, we can actually see a drastic improvement in our local vegetation with these activities. So I think at that, I'll open it up for questions. Let's see how I am on time.
All right, thank you, Moses. We have 5 minutes for questions for any of the presenters, for Moses, for Mitchell, for Andy. And let's see, there's a Q&A section here. For Andy, do you have a preference for treating Phragmites with herbicide? Yeah, a chemical herbicide, yeah, for Phragmites, glyphosate, imazapyr, or imazamox.
I think the latter two would be the ones that I would choose. And I don't have any direct experience with using those two, but those would be the ones to concentrate on, I would say.
All right, thank you. Moses, what invasive plants provide habitat for ticks besides Japanese barberry? Are there others you're aware of?
Basically, any invasive plant that pushes out natives will functionally have higher levels of relative humidity because they tend to be denser growth clusters. And that's part of the reason why you can see increased tick density around them. I mean, as far as, most of them, that's kind of the problem is I would say most invasive plants will actually increase the habitat for ticks because they won't be eaten. So they'll provide optimal questing habitat for the ticks. They'll provide more locations where the ticks can go and rehydrate. And without any active herbivory on the invasives or minimal, it just provides a constant, basically a constant rehydration location, just the same as Japanese barberry does.
We had some presentations today about climate change, and we have the Gulf Coast tick, which is native to the south. Do you foresee other tick species crawling their way up here due to climate change or anything else?
Unfortunately, yes. I know that they're at this point in time, they have confirmed a consistent population of Gulf Coast ticks in New York City within one of the borough parks. So it's frankly just a matter of time until we get enough introductions via birds that we have localized populations on the island for that species. And unfortunately, there are still numerous tick species that can be introduced from agricultural markets or even via ornamental trade if they can make it through on plants. And so that's actually how the Asian longhorn tick supposedly became established in the United States. They are suspect that it came in on agricultural animals at some point in time. And I know the original host was actually a Icelandic sheep, but it didn't have a history of travel, according to the owner. So it was a farm though, and they did actually host various animals for short periods of time. So it could be an animal that they kept there for a week or two that allowed this local populations to start. But Yeah, just through through agricultural movement, I would say we can expect more ticks in the future. And with warming, you will definitely see the range expansion of Lone Star tick, and you will see the densities of deer tick reduced in some locations, and you'll basically see those populations move to more areas where there's consistent moisture. And what we could actually potentially see more American dog ticks as things begin to warm up as well, if that allows open fields and those ecotone habitats to do a little bit better.
Here's another question from Moses. If we manage habitats for more diversity of mammals, would we see a shift in the distribution of the types of tick species? Either good or
You wouldn't-
bad?
Yeah, you wouldn't see a shift in the species of ticks. But if you increase the biodiversity of hosts locally, you likely would see a decrease in the pathogen rates in the local population of ticks. So you would basically give the ticks more options from the host reservoir for those various diseases. And yes, they would be successful and you would still have decent densities of ticks, but a lower percentage of them would carry the pathogen.
All right. Interesting. Ticks are popular here. How about cedar oil and a product like Tick Kills?
We actually tested tick kills back in 2016 with our original arena trials. And based on the data we collected then, we opted not to continue testing it because it did such a poor job. Tick Kills has actually one of the lowest percentages of cedar oil in the formulation. If you look at it for a percent active ingredient per square footage, when you actually apply the product. So it does not have doesn't have enough oomph to really control ticks unless they're under direct contact. And that's very hard to achieve under normal application. So let's see here. There's one on cedar oil as well. So the cedar oil products that we have tested thus far, which would be Cedar Safe, which I believe that is a locally made product by, what is it? It's Plant Tree Surgeons, I believe is the company that actually makes that. But that is a very unique product. If you compare the formulation of Cedar Safe to every other 25B natural oil tick control product on the market, that particular product is 85% pure cedar oil. Your other products on the market would maybe be 25 or 30%. And I know the mix rate on Cedar Safe itself is a quart per acre. So a quart per 200 gallons of water, and you can apply that to an acre. And in the June-July trials, we saw around 60% control for deer tick nymphs, Lone Star and Lone Star nymphs, and about 40% control on Lone Star adults. So that particular Cedar Safe product does have quite a bit of utility for both of those species. Admittedly, it did not work as well as the synthetic pyrethroids. They were around 90 percentile for control in those periods. One thing I will say is with the Cedar Safe product, you get about 20% control in the fall on adult deer ticks. It just does not seem to perform that well under cold temperatures. But that being said, the rosemary products we tested also did not perform very well in the fall, likely due to the cold temperatures. The other cedar oil product that we've tested is Cedar Side. That one is actually sold in almost all 50 states. And that one had slightly lower levels of control than what we found with Cedar Safe. So it was around 45 or 50% control for deer tick nymphs and Lone Star nymphs. And for Lone Star adults, it was around 25 or 30, if I remember correctly. So there's still some utility, but it's expensive.
Yeah.
Compared to your traditional synthetics. But in sensitive locations, it could certainly give you a option. So.
All right. So one more question, and then I'll also remind folks who are applying for continuing education credits to put their names in the chat. And let's see, there's one more. Tick tubes, using tick tubes on residential properties.
So tick tubes have a very interesting history. The actual tick tube product, the original studies that were done on that product were actually done by one of the original patent holders. And that first study that came out was actually behind a paywall. And when you actually looked at the study, it said it controlled ticks on white-footed mice within the study. But in the abstract, the section you generally see of the paper before the paywall, it said very generously that it controlled ticks. And unfortunately, that has given that product quite a bit more market. And there, admittedly, there are about 7 studies with that particular product on the market now. Almost all of them show varying levels of tick control on the white-footed mouse itself. And I think there's 2 current studies that have shown some decreased questing activity for deer tick nymphs in the field. So at this point in time, I actually want to see a little bit more data with that product before I recommend it on its own. I have no problem with someone wishing to use that product in conjunction with other tick management strategies. I think it could potentially have a good place as a supplementary treatment. But based on the data I've seen and the studies on the market, I wouldn't recommend it as a standalone product. There is actually a newer brand. It's Thermacell, I believe, is the company. And it is a slightly different design cotton. So in the Daminex tick tubes, that's basically a cotton ball that's treated with permethrin. In the Thermacell, from my understanding, it is basically it's a larger piece of cotton, which is, from what their data shows, it has a little bit more uptake from the mice, for which is brought back to their nests and used as nesting material.
All right, well, I think we're out of time, Moses. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our speakers, Andy, Mitchell, Moses, thank you very much. There's in the chat for anyone seeking credits with DEC or LACES, there's a link to the survey. And at 4 o'clock, we'll take a short break. At 4 o'clock, we have a speaker, Uli Lorimer, and then our closing. So thank you, everybody. See you back at 4.